All right, so obviously things become very different for Christians living within the Roman Empire. I have 7 things that I identify that I'd like to point out. First of all, persecution stop. This is huge. Number 2, Christians can worship out in the open now or in their own buildings. In some cases, they're actually taking over other houses of worship. 3, fights and schisms become much more open as well. We'll see this with the Donatists, with the Arian controversy. Okay, there are major cultural shifts. Christians aren't countercultural now, so what are they? Churches start getting imperial funding. Wow, this is a difference. And obviously some really nice churches are built with this money. 6, the emperor is getting involved in matters of religion. All right, Constantine is buried in the Church of the 12 Apostles. And then 7, this seems small, but it becomes significant later. Empress Helena's pilgrimage to the Holy Land and building projects. Christians start going on pilgrimages, which sets up kind of a long-term sort of precedent for doing this. Other things of note. The building of Constantinople. In 303, Constantine decides to move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a city called Byzantium. All right, he had previously ruled from various points in the empire, kind of depending on his military campaigns, but this was different. Constantinople was to be his new capital. Obviously, he named it after himself. It is, let me pull up a picture here, a map for you. It has a very, very strategic location. You see, it's sitting right there at the spot linking Europe and Asia Minor. As I said, it was a smaller town, and he goes on this huge building project where he makes it this imperial capital city. All right. So how did the early church remember Constantine and kind of his works? I would say in general there was a lack of critical reflection on the part of early Christians when it came to Constantine. The great early church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, there's a couple of Eusebiuses floating around. I'm talking about Eusebius of Caesarea here. He's a really great example. He was born in 260. And this church history that he wrote is essential for what we know about in the early church. You know, he collected, organized, and published a lot of what we know today. Scholars have suggested that without Eusebius, we'd maybe know half of what we do. Now, in his work, Constantine's conversion becomes like a keystone in the story of Christianity. He largely glosses over Constantine's shortcomings, which he had them, things like executing his own son and one of his wives. And through his work, it is clear to see how Christianity was changing and becoming more accommodating of culture under Constantine's rule. Eusebius may actually be more tempered than some of his contemporaries. There really was an overall lack of critical thinking or assessment when it came to Constantine. There are reports of even Christians offering sacrifices at statues of Constantine after his death, which, wow, okay, think about that for a second. All right, but we try not to be too rough on them. Remember, Christians went from this outlawed, religion facing persecutions to kind of a preferred position in the empire. He probably did seem like a savior to the people. Okay. Obviously, in your discussion post, you're going to talk about whether you think Constantine was a good thing or a bad thing for Christianity. And obviously, issues like this cannot be broken down into this is good or this is bad. But the point of doing this is I want you to kind of think what was gained, what was lost with this conversion moment, because it is so foundational in Christian history. All right, next I want to look at the Donatists in North Africa, because this becomes kind of a point of conflict. This is one of the spots where it becomes pretty tough for legalization. Okay. So the persecutions in North Africa had been particularly bloody, which might have added to this conflict. All right. The authority, think about this for a second. Okay. The authorities that had once persecuted and martyred Christians were now supposed to be their allies. You can see how troubling this was for a number of believers. Okay. So central to this fight that erupts in North Africa between what we'll call the Donatists and then kind of the Catholic party, all right, is the issue of traitors. That was the term the Donatists used to describe anyone who had renounced Christ to save their lives during the persecutions, all right? Now, the Catholic party was actually very lenient. All right, forgiveness was given and lapsed Christians were brought back into the fold. Okay, this became the standard for Christianity moving forward. All right, there are no sins that are so horrible that you cannot be forgiven. All right. The Donatists were not that forgiving on this, okay? They did not want to accept these traitors back into their communities. And one big issue that comes about is that of clergy who would abandon the faith during the persecutions. There became big questions and debates around whether sacraments of apostate priests were valid. Okay, now doctrine is clear now that it is God who performs the sacraments through the priest or the pastor, but this was not all that, this was not established in this time period, so this was a point of conflict as well. The Donatists saying, no, these aren't valid sacraments, and the Catholic party saying, yes, they are valid sacraments. Okay. So another thing of note here involving the Donatists is that for the first time, and this is in the year 317, you have Christians, in this case the Catholic Christians, are actually enacting persecutions against the Donatists. Okay. All right, so what are some of the long-term repercussions of this Donatist controversy? First of all, this conflict was never really solved. You had different Christian churches, some were Catholic, some were Donatists, and they didn't really act or look that different, but everyone knew which was which and which one they went to. And then added into this mess, you get Arian Christianity, which I'm going to talk about next. And then 3, North Africa eventually kind of comes under Islamic control. While there are some significant Christian communities that remain, Irving and Sundquist argue that the dysfunction in North Africa led to the ease of which Islam actually took over. That is something that you can ponder as we go through the semester.